international community has paid tribute to former President Jimmy Carter, who passed away on December 29th. In China, Jimmy Carter is best remembered for normalizing relations in 1979 during his presidency, but also for his genuine friendship with the Chinese people. What has been his legacy as a man and as a political leader? What did he say about the current state of China-U.S. relations?
Hello and welcome to World Insight with me, Tian Wei. U.S. President Joe Biden gave his farewell address to the nation on Wednesday, only 5 days before Donald Trump's inauguration. Given the impacts of the policies and leadership from the world's largest economy, this once again places the U.S. and the world at a historic crossroads. One figure with such influence is former U.S. President Jimmy Carter, whose legacy went on to benefit many. So today we are joined by Terrence Adamson, a close friend and personal attorney to President Carter, and also co-chair of the board of directors of the Henry Luce Foundation. He shares his insights on U.S. political leadership change and also China-U.S. relations. I'm so glad to be joined in the studio by Terrence Adamson, member of the board of the trustees of the Carter Center. What a pleasure to see you, Terrence.
Thank you. It's very nice to be here, and it's nice to see you.
I had the pleasure interviewing him for his last trip to China, personally, his last trip to China. And at that time,
Wonderful.
People already noticed, Terrence, the ongoing tense rhetorics and interactions between China and the United States when it comes to official bilateral relations. I'm sure you have noticed that then. Can you help us to understand, are there ways that we can walk back? If not back, how can we make sure things are not getting worse?
Well, I don't know that we can in many respects, but I hope we try. It's a two-way street, of course. Mm-hmm. It requires action on the Chinese leadership. It requires action on the U.S. leadership. Government to government is, sets the tone, and that's a lot follows from that. Whether we're going to be exchanging students or visitors or sharing programs or working on things together, we were making a lot of progress in that regard. I think from the time of normalization, really for a very long time after that, and so it's been just in very recent times. Mm. And just, you can't sit around and talk about blame particularly, mm-hmm. but you can talk about what can we do to correct it? What can we do? And I know what President Carter would say is keep engaged, stay talking, mm-hmm. stay working on common problems together. Well, we had a lot of success in talking about the environment, working on environment issues together. So it's extremely important that those kinds of things, we should be able to find ways to work and cooperate together. It's going to always be difficult on trade issues. I know they're going to be tough. Mm. But you can try to deal with them in certain ways. And different leaders of different countries will respond in different ways. Our new president is pretty outspoken about the need for trade barriers and tariffs. And that may help in some industries, but it's not in my judgment, not a good policy across the board just to say we have tariffs for tariffs' sake. Because my own belief is that tariffs we pay for them ourselves because it just adds to the price of the goods. So it's not like it's a bank account that you're drawing from. It's a bank you're putting money into and paying for from your people. But anyway, I know I'm no longer involved in those problems particularly, but I think about them and talk about them a lot and read about them a lot. But people of both countries of goodwill who have the capacity need to find ways to work together with your international counterparts, whether they're in America, or whether in Germany or England or wherever, because the world is smaller and smaller, as we all know. And there are consequences to how we how we manage this world.
From a reasonable argument, as you said, to balance the trade, to ideologically belief or single-mindedly belief of decoupling, it seems that we traveled very far within a very short distance of time. How do you understand this extreme of the argument, and it's ever getting stronger, apparently, in Washington, even though you are based in Florida, I understand?
Well, part of it is just domestic politics in the United States.
Yeah.
There's political discourse here that's created just to cast blame on somebody else for our problems. And when you can find an enemy to attack, you can create one. And in part, that's part of the rhetoric that's going on. Is to be tough against the Chinese because they're doing all these things to us is the argument. And it's not that simple. It's not just the fact that there's an enemy. There's not an enemy. You're creating the enemy. And the consequences of doing that is resulting bad policy. But that's in our society. We argue about things like that, and the political process takes place. And the Carter side of the equation, even though he wasn't active in it anymore, the Democrats lost the election, and so now we got the marketplace of ideas, and we have a political process that takes place. Yeah. And the people that like to create enemies that they can argue about, whether it's a people crossing our border or whether it's Chinese in China, they cast blame. They cast blame on the illegal aliens for all kinds of problems that cross the border. And it's an issue. It was an issue when Carter was president, but it was not to the extent it is today. Mm-hmm. But it's overstated as a problem. And the people that cross over are oftentimes people that are poor people that are fleeing some desperate situation, and they're not bad people. They're just poor people. Mm-hmm. And we benefit many times, but our country has long benefited by immigration from other countries. We were made up of people that came from other countries. All of our relatives and ancestors came from other countries, except for the Native Americans who were here before we were.
You know President Carter so well, Terrence. If he can still be called upon by the presidents of both sides and the different levels of society of both sides for advice, what do you think, as a great friend of more than 6 decades, he would say to both sides, especially to the incoming administration in the U.S.?
He did. I mean, President Trump in his first term actually called President Carter to talk about China. And I know a little about the conversation, but I don't know all of it. But I was told by President Carter that it was a good conversation, and he was urging, try to engage at those levels you can engage at, to take the edge off those things that are matters of conflict. I don't know whether the advice was taken or not, but he sought it, and President Carter believed very strongly in that level of engagement, which again is why he made 30 trips to China after he was president, and why he put normalization as high on his priority list. And it was an important accomplishment, and it was at a particularly good time in China, just as Deng Xiaoping became the reformer for the Chinese economy, and that produced a great boon for China to open up at that time. So much progress was being made in terms of people's lives. I know the middle class grew greatly in that period. There were a lot of people that were in villages and poor. Now they're urban and they have good jobs and decent education, and that was a big change over a relatively short period of time.
In one sentence or two, how would you describe a country like China? So that your countrymen and women can know better about this, not just the black and white country, and 1.4 billion people with faces.
There's a lot of nuance, and I've traveled a lot in various parts of China, and there's a lot of difference in China among the peoples in culture, and their own traditions in different parts of China, and it's wonderful to appreciate that. I mean, as an outsider, I love the sense of history in different places in China, and the nature, the cuisine, the food, the beliefs, how people live their lives and what they like to do, and it's a much more diverse country than people realize. It's not just a one thing country. And the people are really lovely people. I've always loved that, and I know President Carter did. He loved to get out in the countryside and see different parts of China. And we went to a lot of different places over the years in our trips. And it's he is the first president to go in no telling how many different provinces. There's never really been a U.S. president in Hunan province, for example, where we went. There'd never been a U.S. president in Hunan province before. But he liked to go these places, and he learned from it. And I know that it's interesting what athletics has done. For example, international athletics, and the basketball is so popular in China, and it's who would have thought that 50 years ago? But it's taken it by storm. I've been in remote villages in very rural China, and I would see a basketball goal in the middle of this little very poor town. And we visited a family not too long ago when I was last in China, and there was a youth playing, and I playing basketball, and I asked through my interpreter who his favorite basketball player, and I was expecting him to say Yao Ming or something like that, and he did. He named the top U.S. player at the time. And it was, to my knowledge, and he just watched him in the NBA finals of that particular year, about 2 years ago, and it was fun. I mean, it's really fun, and that to see that kind of interest, and there's, as I say, there's a lot more in common than there's differences. We have to dwell on the common things, the common values.
If we talk about the differences will certainly get ever larger. If we talk about the common ground and focus on the common ground, we can share more. To Mr. Adamson, President Jimmy Carter was a man of consistency and integrity, and so he was when it came to his interest in China. Throughout their lifetime friendship, Mr. Adamson is familiar with the stories of President Jimmy Carter and China, and was once even a witness. In 2010, President Jimmy Carter visited Zhejiang in Hunan province, central China, where he expressed admiration for the Flying Tigers led by General Claire Chennault, who fought alongside the Chinese against the Japanese invader during the Second World War. I understand this has a lot to do with the deep friendship between you and President Carter over the decades. Tell us more about that.
Well, we've actually known each other 62 years.
Wow.
I met him when I was in high school. I was a senior in high school the first time. He doesn't remember that, but I do. He was in the state legislature in Georgia, and I was a high school student, and we were taken to the legislature to be recognized for winning a debate tournament. And he congratulated us, and and then a couple of years later, when I was a student at Emory, I was in the actual Young Democrats Club on campus, and he came and spoke while he was running for a statewide office in Georgia. At the time, he was running for Congress, and he switched after his visit to Emory at that time. And that's really when we became cognizant of one another. And we had different interrelationships over the years in political campaigns. I spent some time as a newspaper reporter and covered as a newspaper reporter for the Atlanta Constitution,
Good for you.
his 1970 gubernatorial campaign.
Wow.
Yeah, and I served in his administration. I was in the at the Justice Department, working with an Attorney General by the name of Griffin Bell. And then soon after he became a former president, 1981, he asked me to represent him as a lawyer on a particular matter. And I did. And it must have been all right because I continued to be his lawyer from then on. And one of our great prides of my life is working with him and his wife, Rosalind, creating and building and developing in the work of the Carter Center, and have been involved in that for 43 years, which is about a time that he lived after he was president.
Yeah. Congratulations for more than 6 decades of friendship, interaction, and contribution, Terrence. You and President Carter and Mrs. Carter. Having said that, though, you were first time an observer from afar, then working with him remotely, and then become a close partner for a legal counsel, of course, for him and Mrs. Carter. What have you noticed, this evolution, both of him, your friendship, and how that interacts with the changes of the world? I know it's a big question, but I think it is, in retrospect, it's very important.
Well, they were always very warm and friendly. The one thing about both Rosalind and Jimmy Carter, and I often speak of them together because they were together so long. They were married for 77 years. And there was a real partnership. And I'm sure that partnership evolved too over time while he was running for office and while he was governor and then while he was president. And then together they built the Carter Center, and they only died a year apart. She died just after Thanksgiving a year ago. And of course he died on December 29th. And all of us were gathered together in Washington, and in Atlanta first, and then in Washington for his funeral last week. They were ordinary people. It's hard to believe, as talented and smart and intelligent, as successful as he was, and achieved so many great things. He was an ordinary person. He was exactly the same in private as he was in public. And that's a rare quality. And it was very special for both of them. They were as likely to be talking to the person that lived down the street as a person with a very high title or very wealthy or whatever. They love people for people's sake. And their genuineness was true. You know, one of the great things about President and Mrs. Carter is they did live a long time after he was president. And they were very consistent. And people who may not have known him so well when he was president of the United States, he was new on the scene. He was a new political figure. They came to know him very well after he was president.
Yeah.
And the consistency and the kind of principles and integrity and his character and his simplicity in some respects about how he treated people. His belief in human rights, his belief in civil rights, his belief in gender equality, and his commitment and Rosalind's commitment to service. which they did their whole life. They weren't accumulating wealth. They lived in the same simple house they lived in their entire life in Plains, Georgia, a little town of 400 or 500 people.
Do you see that quality still exist and exist strongly these days among political leadership?
No.
Did I hear a long
sadly
sigh?
not. Sadly not, but some do. But it was good for the country. It was good for our country to pause last week. All our flags were at half-mast, and there was a great honor being paid to the kind of people that Rosalynn and Jimmy Carter were, and the service they gave to our nation, and what kind of standard of excellence and personal integrity that they reflected.
One of the things about President Carter and Mrs. Carter is about their courage to interact with China over the decades, starting from the time before the relations was even normalized. It took 7 years, in fact, from Nixon's visit to China to the real normalization of relations between China and the United States. He took tremendous amount of pressure to do that as a president then. And of course, continue to interact, whether it's sunny or rains later in decades. So Terrence, I understand you accompanied them to China many times and work with them on projects with the Carter Center with China. Tell us more about your takeaway of that process as well. What is the nature of this relationship between him, Rosalynn, and China that you have noticed?
Well, I know what we talked about it a lot, and he said his interest in China started when he used to contribute to a missionary fund at his church, the Lottie Moon offerings, and he would contribute money that would be sent to China to support missionary work in China. We're talking the 1920s and 1930s in the time period. He had an uncle who was in the Navy who actually went to China and wrote letters back to him, and so he was always interested in China. And when he was in the Navy, he went to Annapolis, and then he was in the submarine corps. And he was on a diesel submarine, the USS Pomfret, which in 1948 and 1949 that was sailing in the seas adjacent to China. And it was at the time of the birth of New China. He was actually off the coast of China on October the 1st, 1949, when New China was born. And that was special to him. And it really helped create his interest in China. In part, October 1st is his birthday. So I always said he was a little older than modern China. And so it was, he was born on October 1st, 1924. Modern China was born October 1st, 1949. Yeah. So he was very proud of that fact that it was launched his birthday. He talked about being on that submarine, U.S. submarine, and he would dock in Shanghai and Qingdao, and he would talk to people in those towns in that time frame before he could see the fires burning up in the mountains of the revolutionary forces. And he talked about that a lot. He took pictures. He even took some pictures. And I was asking where those pictures were, and he said they were in a shoebox in his closet. And I said, we ought to take a look at those sometime. They might be interesting. But so he had a historic interest in China and had been there as a young man when he was in his 20s on that submarine. And he always was very interested from the time he became president in normalization. But he had other things on the agenda first. The representative from the government of China in Washington at that time visited President Carter in his office, at the Oval Office, the first week he was president. And they said, let's begin to talk about this. And if there's anything, and Carter told him, is there anything I can do for you while you're in China? If you'd like to go to the Kennedy Center, if you'd like to do things, let me know. And so he was very cordial, even before relation with an official representative of the government of China before there was normalization. And then after he completed the ratification of the Panama Canal Treaty, a very important accomplishment while he was president. Almost 2 days later, Zbigniew Brzezinski, his national security advisor, sent a message to the Chinese government that they ought to begin talks. And then there began some secret talks for months, which concluded in December 1978, when Deng Xiaoping and President Carter, and almost simultaneous announcements in both countries, announced that relations were going to be normalized.
Yeah, one of those times, Terrence, if I remember right, was for you to accompany him to Zhejiang in Hunan province to see the base of General Claire Chennault's Flying Tigers, which, of course, gave China tremendous support during the Second World War. Yeah.
I really did enjoy going to that base. So they have a lot of the Flying Tiger airplanes there.
Right.
And there were a lot of wonderful photographs and history maps and showing where they were and what they did. And it was really interesting.
Over the decades, I had the pleasure, got to know the families of the Flying Tigers, by the way. And when they visited China, I interacted with them many times. And every one of them has a unique story to tell about their grandparents or their senior aged father, and it's a history represented and reflected in every family, and as a result of that, every family that we mentioned seemed to have a very strong and unique bond with the people here in China, which also had many families.
And that was a critical part of normalization. I mean, it was having the student exchanges was really important. There was a wonderful story that was told during the negotiations on normalization. President Carter was awakened at night, late at night, by a phone call from his national science advisor, who was over in China before normalization was announced. And he was having discussions with many Chinese leaders, including Deng Xiaoping. And apparently they called President Carter because Deng Xiaoping wanted assurances that 10,000 Chinese students could come to the United States to study, which he considered important, not only for learning technology and math and science and the like that was available in the new technologies, but also just the fact that you were having these exchanges on a people-to-people level. And that's what strengthens bonds, but binds people to people between countries, and is such an important ingredient.
Thank you so much, sir, for your wisdom.
Thank you.
That's my interview with Terrence Adamson. And that's all the time we have for today. If you'd like to know more, search World Insight or check out our YouTube channel. Follow us on X and Facebook. I'm Tian Wei. On behalf of the team, thanks for being with us. Bye.